The Good Morning America studio hummed with the familiar rhythm of live television. Bright lights cast their harsh glow across polished floors, while producers whispered last-minute instructions into their earpieces. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Times Square's towering LED billboards flickered against the crisp winter morning, their colors bleeding into the studio's sterile warmth. Will Smith stepped onto the set in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding immediate attention from the bustling crew. This was his first major live interview since the storm. Everyone knew it, though nobody dared say it out loud. He moved with practiced confidence, but Samir Patel, adjusting the main camera, caught the subtle tells. The way Will's fingers drummed against his thigh, the slight pause before each smile. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dana Brooks, the segment producer, approached with her clipboard clutched tight. "Will, we're thrilled to have you here," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of television enthusiasm. "George is going to focus on the film, your performance, the message, the journey. Keep it positive, keep it real." Will nodded, his smile genuine but guarded. "That's what I'm here for." George Stephanopoulos emerged from the makeup chair, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "Well, good to see you, man. Thanks for doing this." "Always a pleasure, George," Will replied, matching the firm handshake. As they settled into their chairs, the studio lights blazed hotter. The audience murmured with anticipation. This wasn't just another movie promotion. This was Will Smith's return to the spotlight, and everyone in that room knew they were about to witness something significant. The red light glowed. Showtime. "Good morning. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're here with the incredible Will Smith," George began, his voice smooth as silk. The audience applauded, their enthusiasm genuine and warm. "Will, welcome back to Good Morning America." "Thank you for having me, George. It's great to be here." Will responded, settling into his chair with visible relief. The opening felt safe, familiar. This was the Will Smith America had fallen in love with decades ago. George leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "Let's talk about your new film. It's called Redemption Road, and early reviews are calling it your most vulnerable performance yet. Tell us about that." Will's face lit up, his natural charisma taking over. "You know, George, this film, it really spoke to me on a personal level. It's about a man who's made mistakes, who's hurt people he loves, and who has to figure out if redemption is even possible." His hands moved expressively as he spoke, the tension in his shoulders melting away. The character, Marcus, he's not looking for forgiveness, he's looking for understanding of himself, of his choices. The monitor behind them flickered to life, showing a clip from the film. Will's character sat across from his estranged son, tears streaming down both their faces. The audience watched in rapt silence, several wiping their eyes. "That scene right there," George said as the clip ended, "that's raw emotion. How much of Will Smith is in that moment?" Will paused, his smile softening. "More than I'd care to admit, but that's what makes it honest. Art has this incredible power to help us process our own journeys. Sometimes you don't know what you're carrying until you put it into a character." The audience nodded appreciatively. This was going perfectly. George shuffled his notes, maintaining his warm expression. Speaking of journeys," George continued, his tone still conversational but with a subtle shift that made Dana Brooks straighten in her off-camera position. "There's been a lot of discussion about celebrity redemption arcs lately. Some critics have wondered if this film is more about repairing Will Smith's public image than telling an authentic story. How do you respond to that?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Will's animated gestures stilled for just a moment, his smile flickering before returning, tighter now, more controlled. In the camera booth, Samir instinctively adjusted his focus, capturing the micro-expression that crossed Will's face. In the control booth, Dana watched the tension build, her fingers hovering over her radio. That's an interesting way to put it, George. Will said, his voice measured. He shifted in his chair, straightening his already perfect posture. Look, I won't sit here and pretend that my personal experiences didn't inform this role, but that's true for every actor, every performance. The question isn't whether life influences art, it's whether the art is honest. George nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes had sharpened. But surely you understand the skepticism. When someone in the public eye makes mistakes, there's always going to be questions about whether their next project is genuine growth or strategic rehabilitation. A murmur rippled from the studio audience. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the temperature change. Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his media training warring with his natural instincts. I understand skepticism, George, I really do, but I'd ask this. At what point do we allow people to grow? At what point do we accept that mistakes, even public ones, can lead to genuine change? Dana whispered urgently to her assistant, her eyes never leaving the monitors. George glanced at his notes, then back at Will with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's a fair question, but I think our viewers deserve to know. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What began as a friendly promotion was becoming something else entirely. George leaned forward, his professional smile intact, but his eyes calculating. Will, you've been a cultural icon for decades. Kids grew up watching you, looking up to you. When someone in your position makes headlines for the wrong reasons, doesn't that carry a special weight of responsibility? The audience grew noticeably quieter. Some crossed their arms, their body language shifting from warm engagement to uncomfortable observation. Will's jaw, previously animated and expressive, now rested motionless on his knees. Of course it does, Will replied, his voice steady but cautious. I've never taken that responsibility lightly, George, but I'm also human. I make mistakes like everyone else. Mine just happened to play out in front of millions of people. George's eyebrows arched slightly, but that's exactly the point, isn't it? When those mistakes happen in front of millions, when they dominate headlines for months, don't you think that undermines the positive message you've spent decades building? Samir's camera captured a tight close-up of Will's jaw, the muscles working beneath his skin as he processed the question. In the control booth, Dana watched the tension build, her fingers hovering over her radio. I think, Will said carefully, each word measured, that people are smart enough to separate a moment of poor judgment from a lifetime of work. I've made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes don't erase 30 years of trying to inspire people, of creating content that uplifts families, of using my platform responsibly. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. George sensed the room's division and pressed forward. But some would argue that's exactly the problem, George continued, his tone sharpening, that fame and success insulate people from real consequences, that the very platform you mentioned becomes a shield rather than a responsibility. Will's composure showed its first real crack. His eyes flashed and his voice dropped an octave. A shield, George? You have no idea what I've been through. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. George leaned back slightly, but maintained his piercing gaze. I'm sure you have faced consequences, Will, but let me ask you this directly. Were your public apologies genuine expressions of remorse, or were they calculated responses designed to salvage your career? The question hung in the air like a live wire. Will stared at George for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The audience held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Will began, then stopped. He looked down at his hands, then back up at George. That's a hell of a thing to ask someone, George. It's the question everyone's thinking, George replied smoothly. Your comeback has been methodical. The right interviews, the right projects, the right messaging. It feels very strategic. Dana whispered urgently to her assistant about cutting to commercial, but something held her back. The ratings would be through the roof. Will's laugh was short and humorless. Strategic? You think losing everything I worked for was strategic? You think watching my family get dragged through the mud was part of some master plan? I think, George said, lowering his voice for dramatic effect, that you're a very intelligent man who understands the power of narrative, and sometimes the most powerful narrative is redemption. The accusation hit like a slap. Will's entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the diplomatic movie star. In his place sat a man whose patience was wearing dangerously thin. "So let me get this straight," Will said, his voice gaining an edge that made several crew members glance at each other nervously. "You think I orchestrated my own downfall just so I could climb back up? You think I put my family through hell for a storyline?" George's slight smirk was barely perceptible, but Will caught it. The interviewer was enjoying this, feeding off the conflict like a predator scenting blood. "I think," George said carefully, "that you're very good at crafting narratives, and I think our viewers deserve to know if this is Will Smith or just another character you're playing." The challenge was unmistakable now. The gloves were off. George shuffled his notes deliberately, the sound crisp in the suddenly tense studio. "Will, your recent work, this film included, has been praised for its emotional depth and personal reflection, but some critics have suggested that no matter how heartfelt your performance is, they'll always be overshadowed by your past actions, that your comeback is more about public relations than genuine artistic expression. How do you reconcile that?" Will's hands clenched into fists on his knees, his knuckles whitening. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before, raw, unfiltered Philadelphia coming through the Hollywood polish. "Reconcile that?" Will repeated, his tone incredulous. "Let me tell you about reconciliation, George. I've spent the last year examining every choice I've made, every moment where I could have done better. I've worked with therapists, with spiritual advisors, with my family to understand how I got to that place. I've sacrificed projects, relationships, opportunities, all in the name of becoming better." The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the smooth, charismatic Will Smith they expected. This was something rawer, more human. "But that's exactly what I'm talking about," George pressed, sensing blood in the water. "The therapy, the spiritual journey, the family work, it all sounds very curated, very much like what a PR team would recommend for someone trying to rehabilitate their image." Samir instinctively zoomed closer, catching the moment Will's eyes turned cold. In the control booth, Dana found herself frozen between cutting away and letting the train wreck continue. "Curated?" Will's voice was dangerously quiet now. "You think my pain was curated? You think my family's suffering was focus grouped?" "I think," George said, maintaining his professional composure, despite the palpable tension, "that you're very good at crafting narratives, and I think our viewers deserve to know if this is Will Smith or just another character you're playing." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Will leaned forward in his chair, his entire body coiled with tension. In the control booth, Dana was frantically debating whether to cut to commercial, her hand hovering over the emergency button. "You want to know what's real, George? This is real. The man sitting in front of you who's tired of having his genuine attempts at growth dissected by people who have never walked in his shoes." The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras. Even George seemed to realize he might have pushed too far, but there was no backing down now. "That's all anyone's asking for," George said quietly. "Authenticity." Will stared at him for a long moment, his breathing controlled but his eyes blazing. "No, George, what you're asking for is blood, and I'm done bleeding for your entertainment." George straightened in his chair, his journalistic instincts overriding any sense of caution. "Will, let me ask you something directly. Do you believe your fame and success have shielded you from the kind of real consequences that ordinary people would face for similar actions?" The question detonated in the silence like a bomb. Will went completely still, his eyes locked on George's face. The audience collectively held its breath, some leaning forward in anticipation, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Will said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "Real consequences?" Will's voice was deadly quiet. You want to talk about real consequences, George? I think it's a fair question, George replied, though for the first time since the interview began, there was a slight tremor in his voice. Most people in similar situations would face legal ramifications, job loss, social ostracization. Stop. Will's voice cut through George's words like a blade. Just stop, right there. The audience gasped audibly. Several people in the front row sat back as if physically pushed. Samir's camera captured every micro-expression on Will's face, the flaring nostrils, the set jaw, the eyes that seemed to burn with suppressed fury. "You think I haven't faced consequences?" Will continued, his voice rising slightly. "You think losing projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars isn't real? You think having my children harassed at school isn't real? You think watching my wife become a punchline isn't real?" George opened his mouth to respond, but Will wasn't finished. "You sit behind that desk, George, judging lives you've never lived, consequences you've never faced. You want to talk about ordinary people? Ordinary people don't get their worst moments broadcast to the world. Ordinary people get second chances without having to earn them on live television." The confrontation had crossed a line and everyone in the studio knew it. George's professional composure flickered, but he pressed forward like a boxer refusing to go down. "Will, I understand you face consequences, but with great platform comes great responsibility. When public figures act out, it sends a message, especially to young people who look up to them. Don't you think your actions, regardless of the personal cost, perpetuate harmful examples?"
Comes from hard work, that family matters, that you can overcome anything with determination. One mistake, one moment of human failure, and suddenly I'm a cautionary tale? But that's exactly the point, George shot back, his own composure beginning to crack. When you're in the position you're in, one moment of failure can undo decades of positive influence. That's the burden of fame. Will stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. The sudden movement sent the shock through the studio. Crew members stepped back, the audience gasped, and Samir's camera automatically followed Will's towering frame. "Burden?" Will's voice boomed across the studio. "You think fame is a burden I signed up for? You think I asked to have every moment of my life dissected by people like you?" George remained seated, but leaned forward, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You chose this life, Will. You chose the spotlight, the money, the influence. And with that choice comes accountability." "Accountability to who?" Will demanded, his voice echoing off the studio walls. "To you? To the media machine that feeds on human suffering? I've been accountable to the people who actually matter, my family, my friends, the communities I serve." Samir's split screen showed Will's clenched fists alongside George's increasingly strained expression. The tension was so thick it seemed to press against the camera lens itself. "I'm not selling redemption, George," Will continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm living it. And if that's not good enough for you, that's your problem, not mine." George's next words came out measured and cold, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "But that's just it, isn't it, Will? Even now, even in this moment, you're performing. This anger, this indignation. How do we know this isn't just another character? How do we know the real Will Smith isn't the man who lost control that night, and everything since then has been an elaborate act for the cameras?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Will went completely still, his breathing the only movement in his entire frame. The studio fell so silent that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. Slowly, deliberately, Will reached up and unclipped his microphone. The small device hit the coffee table between them with a sharp click that echoed through the studio like a gunshot. "You know what, George?" Will's voice was eerily calm now, more dangerous in its quietness than it had been in his anger. "I'm done. I'm done pretending that this," he gestured broadly at the studio, at George, at the cameras, "is journalism. This isn't the conversation, George. This is an ambush, and I don't do ambushes anymore. Will turned toward the exit, his movement fluid and final. George, for the first time since the interview began, seemed genuinely rattled. "Will, wait!" George called out, but his voice sounded weak after Will's commanding presence. "No," Will said, without turning around. "We're done here." The cameras followed him as he walked toward the studio doors, his stride confident, despite the chaos he was leaving behind. The studio doors swung shut behind Will Smith with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire building. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the Good Morning America studio existed in a vacuum of stunned silence. The audience sat frozen, some with their mouths agape, others recording with their phones, despite the no-camera policy. George Stephanopoulos remained in his chair, his professional mask finally slipping to reveal something approaching shock. His notes lay scattered on the desk, suddenly irrelevant. The confident interviewer who had systematically dismantled his guest's composure now looked like a man who had won a battle but lost something far more valuable in the process. Samir's camera caught it all. The empty chair still spinning slightly from Will's abrupt departure, the microphone lying abandoned on the coffee table like a discarded weapon, and George's hands trembling almost imperceptibly as he tried to process what had just happened. From her position off-camera, Dana Brooks felt the weight of live television pressing down on her. Millions of viewers were watching, waiting for someone to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Social media was already exploding. She could see her assistants frantically monitoring their phones, their faces pale with the realization that they'd just broadcast television history. George cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. He looked directly into the camera, his years of experience finally kicking in, though his voice carried a tremor that all his training couldn't quite hide. "Well, that was, unexpected. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll discuss what just happened here and what it means for the ongoing conversation about accountability, redemption, and the responsibility that comes with fame." The red light on the camera dimmed, but the questions it had captured would burn long after the broadcast ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.